Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. In this one, we're going to be kicking off a new series called the Autoimmune series. And in the Autoimmune series, we're going to be talking about what the literature says as of today to best manage these individuals who are struggling with an autoimmune disease. And in this first episode, we're just kind of be laying the foundation and laying the groundwork. In the first one, I want to talk about why it's important to understand the various stages of autoimmunity, and especially for somebody who is struggling with an autoimmune disease, why it's important for you to understand the various stages so that you have the most advantageous management plan as you move forward and as you progress through care that will ultimately lead you to experience the best possible outcomes while struggling with this condition. My name is Dr. Matthew Shem. I'm the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers here in Colorado Springs. And here is kind of a broad overview of all the things that we're going to be discussing in the videos to come. And in today's video, we're just going to be touching on a couple of points, the top 2 points in this education category. And before we get too deep into this, I just want you to be able to understand that there is generally no cure for autoimmune disorders. And I think this is really important for you to take into consideration, especially when you're looking for a provider who can help you manage this condition, because anybody that is promising you a cure is either light years ahead of what we currently know today and just some sort of genius, or they just have no idea what they're talking about. But the important thing to know is that these symptoms can be managed. So here is a little diagram of the roller coaster ride that you are on whenever you are experiencing or are dealing with an autoimmune disease. And so the important thing to know is that there will be good days and there will be bad days. You will have days of remission and you will have days of active flare-ups. And the whole goal for me, as somebody who is managing individuals with an autoimmune disease, is to make sure that you get into remission and hopefully have remission last for many, many years. And on top of that, try and make it to where you do have these occasional flare-ups, but make it to where those flare-ups aren't necessarily so bad. Because despite your best efforts, you will have flare-ups. And it's important to understand that this is a flare-up and this is not your new state of health. Because there are a multitude of different possible reasons as to why you could have an active flare-up. And that is one of the reasons as to why we're going to be talking about the stages of autoimmunity to help you better distinguish what is leading to this active flare-up, what is the trigger, because the reality is it could be a bunch of different things. Whether you had a death in the family, you got audited by the IRS, maybe you got the common flu, maybe you took on an extra project at work and you haven't been able to sleep very much, or it could be just a combination of a bunch of little things, like maybe you had some accidental gluten exposure, or the meal that you ate was excessively salted, or maybe you had a meal or a beverage that had some food coloring in it. These are all things that we're going to be talking about as we get into how food affects our autoimmune disease. So when it comes to stages, the first stage is called silent autoimmunity, and that is whenever we have elevated antibodies, but there's no symptoms of loss of tissue. So for example, let's say that whenever I have an individual that presents to my office and they've either been told that they have an autoimmune disease, or maybe I'm just skeptical that they may have an autoimmune disease, I like to run labs. And so one lab panel that I run looks at all these different antibodies towards different tissues in your body. And let's say, for example, that collagen complex comes back on that panel. Now we know that you have elevated antibodies towards collagen, which is in your joints. And so if you had elevated antibodies on blood work, but now I don't have any swelling of my joints or any pain or anything like that, now we know that this is going to be in stage 1 or silent autoimmunity, because the antibodies are present, but I don't notice any pain. And this is obviously where we want to catch things in the most earliest of stages. Then when we get into stage 2, this is called autoimmune reactivity. And autoimmune reactivity is whenever you also have elevated antibodies, but now you're starting to experience symptoms. But there is no clinically noticeable loss of tissue. So for example, maybe again, talking about rheumatoid arthritis, I have these elevated antibodies like collagen on my blood panel, but I also have symptoms. So now I'm starting to get some joint pain, but I don't have any clinically noticeable loss of tissue. So like no swelling of my joints. If we were to take films, I don't have any actual destruction of tissue that you would notice on, let's say, x-ray. And then when we get into stage 3, that's full-blown autoimmune disease. And full-blown autoimmune disease is whenever I not only have elevated antibodies, I also have symptoms, and now I have measurable tissue destruction. So again, talking about, let's say, arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. I have collagen complex antibodies present on blood work. I also have joint swelling and pain in these joints. I also have measurable tissue destruction. So whether it be the swelling of the joints, or we take films and we see that there's actually destruction of the bones in the joints itself, now we know we're in full-blown autoimmune disease stage 3. And why it's important to know these different things is because we want to be able to monitor how these things are progressing. So it can be really difficult to progress or be difficult to monitor because let's say, for example, that we run this panel because we have an inkling and an idea, or maybe another provider told you that you had Hashimoto's. Okay. Now you have Hashimoto's. That's where you have autoimmunity towards your thyroid gland, where your immune system is attacking your own thyroid. And so what you would see, it's here on stage 3, you would see thyroglobulin or thyroid peroxidase antibodies present on your blood work. And you're also going to have all the different Hashimoto symptoms, which could be a whole nother video in itself. But if we then look, and you also have either presence of, let's say, collagen complex antibodies, but I don't actually have, that's where you would have things like rheumatoid arthritis, but you don't actually have any pain in your hands or pain in your joints. Or maybe you have presence of islet cell antibodies, and that would be where in the pancreas you secrete insulin to break down this glucose. And this could lead you to the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. Or maybe you have something like myelin basic protein on your blood work. And so this would give me an idea that maybe you're leaning towards the route of MS. Okay. And so whenever we catch these things in stage 1, now it helps us manage these things as we move forward. So for example, let's say we're doing our best efforts. We know all the things that we shouldn't be doing and we're avoiding them. But every Friday we go to our favorite restaurant and we get the same thing because it's just whatever this meal is, it's my favorite meal and I just love it, right? Well, I'm starting to notice that every time I go to that restaurant and I eat this meal that I just love, I start noticing, let's say I start noticing that my joints start to get a little bit inflamed and start to hurt a little bit. Or let's say I start noticing some insulin resistant type symptoms, like I eat this meal and then I start feeling really tired and sluggish after I eat. Or maybe I notice full-blown neurologic symptoms. So these are all the different possibilities with the examples that we have on the screen here with collagen complex antibodies, islet cell antibodies, or myelin basic protein. Okay. And so with these different things, now we can say every time I go to this restaurant, I notice one of these different things. So let's just stick with, let's say, collagen complex, right? So every time I go to this restaurant, I have this great meal, and then I start noticing that I feel a little inflamed and my joints start to hurt. Well, now we know that whatever is in that meal that I'm eating every Friday when I go to this particular restaurant, that it's progressing my collagen complex antibodies from stage 1 silent autoimmunity into stage 2 autoimmune reactivity. And so now we know that that is progressing my autoimmunity. And so we want to stay away from whatever it is that is in that one trigger. Okay. So now we have to work back and say, well, what is it that I'm eating in that meal or throughout that day that is leading my collagen complex antibodies to progress from stage 1 to stage 2. And then we can start digging into the meal and to all these different factors and say, well, maybe there was accidental gluten exposure, or they cook that sandwich or whatever it may be on the same griddle that gluten is placed on. There's so many different things that we can now be able to monitor to be able to say, I'm going to try and keep this autoimmunity and stay in remission for as long as possible and avoid these active flare-ups. So I hope that you were able to learn something, and I hope you enjoyed the class. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or give my office a call, and I hope to see you in the next one.